Well, we're just about 36 hours out now from the big election that we mentioned in our lesson this morning. It's really close. It's amazing. It's finally gotten here. It seems like we've been talking about this forever, but the election day is upon us. And there are a lot of concerns about the outcome. And we mentioned that also this morning a little bit. But one of the concerns specifically is how will people react if their candidate doesn't win the race? What if their candidate loses? What will be the reaction? You know, there's even been concern that there'll be civil unrest, maybe demonstrations, rioting, looting, all kinds of fighting. What will be the outcome if one wins versus the other, or vice versa? What will be the outcome? Even more specifically, how will we react? How will we react if our guy isn't the winner? You know, I think all of us here, we've been attuned to this political season. We've been listening to all the news coverage and all. My guess is there are not very many undecided voters amongst us. We have our preferences. How will you react? How will I react if our particular guy is not the winner? The one I voted for didn't get the votes, and so he's not going to be the president, or whatever other office for that matter that you may be voting for on Tuesday. What will we do? In view of the upcoming election, I thought we'd spend some time reviewing a subject that we have actually talked about before. How should we view and what should be our thought process concerning the government and civil authority? And so we're going to spend just a few minutes tonight sort of developing that theme. What should be our view of the government and civil authority? We stop here just briefly to say thanks for being here. And I also want to extend an apology to the young people who came expecting to have their Bible drill class tonight and they didn't get to have it. And I'm sorry for that. We'll try to do better. We got involved in talking in the men's meeting and didn't get done in a timely fashion. And I didn't get out here to do the children's drill class. And I'm sorry for that. I apologize to you kids. And we will try to do better in the future. But thanks to everybody for being here tonight. So, what are you going to say? What are you going to say about the government, civil authority? Well, first of all, the point that you know well is that civil government is divinely ordained. It's important for us to acknowledge this. Actually, civil government is a part of God's plan for our lives. We think that God has planned things in such a fashion that when His will is followed, it's in our best interest. For instance, if we were talking about marriage, we would talk about all the aspects of the husband and wife relationship, and we would say that God put all those things into place because He knew what was best for us, and if we will do what He says to do, our lives will be enriched in the process, right? We could say the same thing about parents and children and so forth. Well, I believe we should understand that to be the case about civil government too. That it is a part of God's broad plan for our well-being. He ordained it to be so. Remember what Jesus said to Pilate when He was on trial before Pilate? Jesus said to Pilate, then saith Pilate unto him, this is John 19 beginning verse 10. Then saith Pilate unto him, speakest thou not to me? In other words, Jesus wouldn't answer. Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and have power to release thee? Jesus answered, thou couldst have had no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Notice, Jesus said, thou couldst have had no power against me, except it were given thee from above. It's not that Jesus was saying to Pilate, you have no authority over me. He didn't say that. What He did say was that the source of the authority that Pilate possessed was from God, His Father. And so Jesus acknowledged that civil government has such power granted to and given to them by God. So if it's from God, we should submit to it. Wouldn't you think that that would be a obvious follow-up? If civil government is from God, we should be submissive to it. In the text that was read to us just a moment ago, in Romans chapter 13, beginning verse 1, let every soul be subject to the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. I think that's a really straightforward statement. And it goes to the fact that civil government is ordained of God and for our well-being. And so we need to start all considerations with that foundation. This arrangement of having civil governments and civil authorities ruling over men is part of what God has put in place. We understand that the Bible teaches that government's principal function, as assigned by God, is to maintain justice. Now, in our day and time, government has gotten into all kinds of roles and all sorts of different realms, and the government's got its finger into almost every piece of the pie when it comes to society and the functioning of society. And sadly, in many instances, it has forsaken the one main role that God intended for them to fulfill. The principal God-given function of civil government is to maintain justice. Go to Romans 13 again, read a little bit further. In Romans 13, verse 3, continuing, rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou wilt do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. There's a lot in that statement. For instance, when it speaks of he beareth not the sword in vain, we sometimes focus on that phrase to say that God has even granted the authority to civil governments to exercise capital punishment against those who commit capital crimes. He beareth not the sword in vain. He is the minister of God to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. And so again, this passage, a well-known text concerning civil government, certainly teaches that God has assigned to civil government the job of maintaining justice. Peter said in 1 Peter 2, beginning verse 13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him. Notice, them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers, for the praise of them that do well. And so, again, this is what government's supposed to do. Can the government be in the welfare business? Well, I suppose that it can be. Can the government be in the regulatory business over environmental affairs? Well, I suppose they can be. They certainly have put themselves in that capacity, right? Can the government be in the healthcare business? Well, I guess they can, because they certainly do. But those things are not the jobs that God specifically designed government to fulfill. Those are not the purposes for which He ordained it. The purpose for which He ordained it was to maintain justice, to punish evildoers, and to praise those who do well. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 25, Jesus confirmed this about government. In Matthew 5, verse 25, Jesus said, agree with thy adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Jesus there was acknowledging this very principle that we're stating, that God has given civil government the function of maintaining justice. All right, with these foundation stones in place, let's say then, these things being true, that we can and actually should appeal to government for this purpose. We should expect and ask and even demand that government do this job. Paul did. On more than one occasion, Paul called upon his privilege and right as a Roman citizen. We just, last Wednesday night in our class, when we were talking about Paul and Silas when they were arrested in Philippi, Paul called upon his rights as a Roman citizen, if you recall. Here's another instance in the life of Paul where he did that. You may remember that he had been arrested, though not formally charged. He had been arrested in Jerusalem. He had been transported to Caesarea Philippi, but when a new Roman governor came in, that new Roman governor said, let's go back to Jerusalem and face your accusers. Paul knew that there was a plot in place to kill him. If that happened, he knew he would be killed. And so that's sort of the background of this statement. Paul said, I stand at Caesar. This is Acts 25, beginning verse 10. Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender or committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me to them. I appeal unto Caesar. As a Roman citizen, he had that right. And he was specifically exercising that right as a Roman citizen with the expectation that the Roman government would fulfill the role that it's supposed to fulfill in protecting an innocent man from being killed by his violent enemies. And so again, what we have here is a precedence being set biblically, wherein we can expect government to do this job. We can call upon government to do this job. We should expect government to do this job. Now, there are obvious failures in that regard. And we could spend a lot of time talking maybe about particular examples that we know of or have heard of wherein the government did not punish an evildoer. In fact, did just the opposite, punished the one who did well and let the evildoer go free. We know, sadly, of too many instances like that. And so they don't perfectly fulfill this God-given role. And that being the case, I believe that we could say that it is reasonable, that it's allowable for us to criticize government when it fails to do what God set it in place to do. Now, I want to really emphasize that when we criticize, we need to show respect, in particular show respect for those who hold office over us, that we are supposed to be submissive to the government. We already made that point. But, and I got to admit here, I'm sure there have been instances where when I've been talking about certain government political leaders that I don't agree with, that sometimes I have not spoken as respectfully as I should have. I've heard Christians use very harsh language relative to certain leaders that they didn't approve of. You know, maybe the president, past or present, is not the one you like. And so you would say things like, that moron in the White House, you can't believe what he did. Well, that president in the White House is our appointed leader. And when we speak of him, though, I think we have the privilege in this country to criticize our government. But when we do so, let's really make sure that we stay within that realm of respect for those who are in such positions of authority over us. But again, with having said that, it is fair to criticize them when they fail. Here's an example from the life of Jesus. Now, Jesus is perfect, right? Jesus never did anything wrong. And so what he did here was an acceptable thing. Luke 13, beginning verse 31, the same day there came certain of the Pharisees, saying to him, Get thee out, depart hence, for Herod will kill thee. And then Jesus said to them, Go ye and tell that fox, Behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Well, that's something, isn't it? Jesus said concerning Herod, you go tell that fox what I said and what I'm going to do. Well, that may seem a little bit harsh, but it certainly was critical of Herod, but it was just and it was direct. And I'd have to say, in the case of Jesus, because we know he's a perfect man, that it was not disrespectful or sinful for him to thus criticize Herod, who was the king. Paul, again, another example from the life of Paul, where Paul understood you're supposed to show due respect to those who hold office over you. This is in Acts 23, and Paul had been arrested in Jerusalem, and he was called before the Jewish council, and they were making accusations against him. And Paul said, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And they that stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest? Notice, then Paul said, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. And so this guy was a bad guy. This Ananias was a bad guy. You remember that he was one of those who had a part in the condemnation of Jesus and Jesus being crucified. And so he was not a good guy. But Paul said, when Paul spoke harshly against him, and they said, oh, do you realize what you just did? Paul said, oh, I didn't know he held that office. I'm not supposed to speak evil of the ruler of my people. And so, again, I think Paul shows this principle. It's fair to criticize, but we need to do so with respect. As servants of Christ, then, relative to the civil government, let me suggest several things I think that we need to do. Again, this may all become very challenging for us in the days ahead. If there is trouble following the upcoming election, if there's civil unrest, if there's all kinds of problems, who knows? We just don't know. I got to tell you, though, I think it's different than any election I can remember in my lifetime. The threat, the danger, the potential for problems is greater than any time I can ever remember. So what should we do? Well, as Christians, we should pray for those in authority. That's a duty that is assigned to us. In 1 Timothy 2, beginning verse 1, I exhort therefore that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and givings of thanks be made for all men, for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. So, one of the expectations on us as Christians is that we pray for our civil leaders. What are you going to pray about? Well, I'm going to pray that we get a president who will make the economy boom. I'm going to pray that we get a president that will strengthen our military and put us back in a position that we had before, where we were sort of the world's ultimate superpower. I'm going to pray that a guy will be elected who will straighten out all the health care mess. Or I'm going to pray for a president who's going to have immigration policies that I agree with. That's not what we were told to pray about, right? The main emphasis, pray for those in authority that we may lead a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and honesty. What we really should be praying for when we pray about these things, and I think we should be busy praying right now, specifically praying about the outcome of this upcoming election. But we should pray that there will be peace and that we can pursue godliness. And so our prayers really should be focused on the fact that whatever happens, it will affect a turn in a more righteous path for our country and not a less righteous path. That it will turn things in a more peaceful, not a less peaceful way. Those are the two things that really ought to be important to us, peace and righteousness. And those are the things that we ought to be praying about. But we should be praying for our civil authorities. Again, we understand that we can criticize. That was our point here. We can criticize, but do we pray? We can offer our criticisms, but do we pray? I think that we should. Another, I think, obvious thing here is that we need to pay our taxes. Our government spends lots of money. I mean, spends more money than an average person can even comprehend. Our government spends so much money. And part of that money comes from our taxes, right? But I'll tell you something else. Part of the money goes to things that I don't agree about. For instance, part of the tax money that we spend or that we send in is spent to fund abortions. Right? We're all against that. So I'm deciding, someone says, that since the government is spending money for things that I don't agree about, I'm not going to spend in my taxes. And I've known of people who've made that decision. Several years ago, there was a Church of Christ up in Ohio, and the whole membership had taken that position. They weren't going to send in their tax money because the government was spending the money for things they didn't approve of. The only problem with that is that Jesus' own statement would argue against that conclusion. In Matthew 22, beginning verse 17, tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he said unto them, whose is this image and superscription? They said unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar, and unto God the things which are God's. So the very question is, should we pay taxes to the Roman government? Now get that. The question was about the Roman government in particular. Should we pay our taxes to the Roman government? The Roman government, one of the most corrupt governments that ever existed in the history of time. And Jesus said, you pay your taxes. Have we got a corrupt government? Have we got a government that spends money in ways they shouldn't spend money? Our tax dollars in ways they should? Yes, absolutely yes. But the principle is very clear here. Render unto Caesar's. Render unto Washington, D.C. is that which is theirs, and unto God that which is His. So I think without a doubt, we need to be paying our taxes. Again, in Romans 13, we've been looking quite a bit at Romans 13. Look in Romans 13. Verse 6, for this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers. Render therefore to all their dues. Tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. There's just no doubt about that conclusion. So, that's a given, and shouldn't even be a doubt in our mind about that. Relative to the civil government, obey its laws. Again, I think that could become a challenging thing in days to come. Things could turn out to where they put upon us certain requirements that we just don't really approve of. For instance, one political candidate says he's going to lock down our economy again if he's elected, and he's going to mandate that all of us wear masks all the time. Well, I don't like that. I particularly don't like mask wearing. I'm just not comfortable wearing a mask. What if the government said, and this was certainly a potential, right? Because one candidate has already said so. What if the government mandated you have to wear a mask every time you step outside your house and all the time throughout the entire day? What would we do? Well, we obey its laws, right? We obey its laws. That's what we have to do. And I really believe that is obvious based upon what we've already discussed, but certainly something to be reminded about. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 59, now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. Jesus did so well in, my point here in bringing that up, and we looked at that verse earlier today. My point in bringing that up is Jesus did so well in obeying the authorities that they couldn't even come up with an accusation against him. That's my point here. How well did Jesus obey the laws that pertain to him, both religious and civil laws that pertain to him? He did it perfectly. He did it so perfectly that when they wanted to find somebody who could make an accusation against, they couldn't do it. They had to bring up liars who would give false testimony because there was nothing that he had ever done wrong. So Jesus, again, in days of corrupt government and leaders, was doing a flawless job of obeying the instructions that they gave. In 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning verse 12, Peter says, having your conversation, we know that word means manner of life, having your manner of life honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Well, I'm going to submit to the ones that I agree with. I'm going to submit to the ones that make sense to me. But when they put out some of these rules that I don't think make any sense, I'm not doing that. No. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Romans 13 verse 5 says, you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, That is, they might punish me if I don't. But also for conscience sake, because I need to do that because it's the right thing to do, and I want to be right with God. I can't have a clear conscience if I have knowingly violated the commands of the civil authority. Obviously, we know there's one huge caveat to all that we just said, and that is we would not obey civil government if they instructed us to do something contrary to the will of God. And you know this passage well from Acts chapter 5. Beginning verse 27, when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did not we straightly command you that you should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. That's the big caveat. The only time where we would choose not to obey what the civil authority instructed us to do is if they instructed us to do something that would be contrary to the will of God. Let me suggest to you that what we ought to do relative to our government, really relative to our whole society, is that we ought to live righteous lives. We're concerned. We're very concerned about our nation, about the trends that we see, about the future, about the outcome of this coming election. And what have we done here? I think I just lost. What happened? I don't know why I did that. We'll keep going here. Live righteously. We're worried about all of these things. What can we do? Well, I want to tell you, the fact of the matter is we have relatively very little influence over things that are taking place in Washington, D.C. We have a vote, and we should exercise our vote, I think. It's a way to use our influence for good. But we just got one vote, and there are going to be millions of votes cast. We don't have a lot of influence over decision making in Washington, D.C. We don't have a lot of decision making over things that happen in Nashville, Tennessee. We maybe have a little more, but really not a tremendous amount of impact even upon matters that pertain to our local government. But the one thing we can do is that we can live righteous lives. You remember Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Righteousness, well, I can contribute to that. I can help in that regard, right? And we all need to. Jesus, you know, said in Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. He certainly did that. And we are expected to do that as well. Paul taught the same concept in Philippians 2, verse 15. Be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. So, as servants of Christ, several things that we can do. Pray, pay taxes, obey laws, live righteously, and finally, let me add, speak out. Teach God's truth. There are a lot of horrible things happening in our world, and our government sadly has a part in some of the horrible things that are happening. We mentioned in our discussions today, we mentioned, for instance, the horrible sin of abortion. And it really truly is a horrible thing that our government has allowed, that our government has legalized, and that some of our political leaders adamantly support the taking of innocent life. The numbers are just staggering. You remember that the Roe versus Wade decision was handed down in 1973. So that'll soon be 50 years. It's not quite 50 years yet, 47 years, something like that. You know how many babies have been killed just in the United States by the horrible sin of abortion? I heard a number just recently. It's now well over 60 million, 61, 62 million babies have been killed. Now, if you want to get a handle on just how bad that is, you could compare that, and we've done this before, you could compare that to how many American soldiers have died fighting for our country. Do you know what that number is? If you went all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and you counted every military activity since then, including the very bloody World War I and World War II and everything, leading up to our current military actions in the world today. You know how many American soldiers have died in all of that over the 200 plus year history of the United States? 1.5 million. Well, that's a lot of people. 1.5 million soldiers have died. Well, we erect monuments to our fallen war heroes, but that number pales in comparison to how many babies have been killed by abortion. We got a lot of problems. Our nation is not a righteous nation. We need to speak out about things like that. We need to speak out about things like same-sex marriage and homosexuality and so forth. We need to speak out. We need to take a stand. We need to be vocal. We need to use our vote relative to moral issues like that and others. I'm not saying that's everything. Please understand, I'm not saying those are the only two questions that come to mind when we think about who we will vote for, but those are certainly questions worth asking. Use your influence, speak up. Vote's one way, but it's not the only way. We need to be speaking out and teaching God's truth. Psalm 119, verse 46, I will speak of thy testimonies also before kings and will not be ashamed. We should not be ashamed of God's truth and His standard for right living. Well, there's just some reminders. I don't think there's any new ground. We haven't plowed any new ground there in our lesson tonight, but just some reminders. Because who knows what future days may bring. But as Christians, we know how we should view all of this relative to what the Bible teaches us concerning the government and civil authority. Thanks for your good attention to what we've had to say. Hope it's helpful. We're going to sing a song of invitation. Our lesson tonight's not been designed to motivate someone to obey the gospel, but we wouldn't want to end without providing that opportunity. If you need to obey the gospel tonight, we'd be anxious to assist you. If you need the prayers of the saints, we'd be glad to pray with you and for you. How can we help? Let us know while we stand and sing.